Adanna stared at her phone, her hands trembling. The contract she had worked so hard for, the one she had poured months of effort into, was gone. Just like that. Awarded to someone else, someone with powerful connections. It was unfair. It was painful. It was a battle she never saw coming. But she knew what she had to do. Adanna was born into a poor home. Her parents were traders, hardworking but struggling to make ends meet. Growing up in a small village, her parents, though hardworking traders, were always struggling to make ends meet. Her mother sold fruits, while her father traded fabrics. There were days when they had just enough to get by, and other days when hunger gnawed at their stomachs. But what they lacked in wealth, they made up for in ambition. Adanna could see the hunger in her parents' eyes, not for food, but for a better life for their children. From an early age, Adanna had learned to be resourceful. She used to wake up before the sun rose to fetch water, help her mother with the small vegetable stand, and run errands for her father. But even with all the responsibilities, her love for learning never wavered. She had an innate curiosity, a thirst for knowledge that was fueled by her desire for something beyond the confines of the village. However, school was a constant challenge. Adanna was often the last to arrive, her shoes worn thin, and her uniform patched up from years of use. She couldn't afford the luxury of extra textbooks, and there were days when the only meal she had was a handful of groundnuts from home. But in the midst of all the hardship, Adanna's mind was her sanctuary. She would read her textbooks over and over again, committing everything to memory. When the other children went out to play, Adanna stayed behind to study by the dim glow of a kerosene lamp. The light was feeble, but to her, it was a beacon of hope, guiding her toward the future she envisioned. Her classmates often ridiculed her for being the bookworm or the teacher's pet, but Adanna never let their words deter her. She would smile quietly, knowing that their mockery was simply a reflection of their own limitations. "She's too ambitious," they would whisper, "she'll never make it." But those words only strengthened her resolve. She prayed every night, asking God for guidance, strength, and clarity. And though she faced many lonely nights, Adanna always found solace in her faith, believing that with God, nothing was impossible. When the time came for her to apply to university, the process seemed like a distant dream. Her family didn't have the money for tuition, and there were no connections to pull strings on her behalf. The thought of applying seemed almost futile. But something inside her refused to let go of the idea. Adanna pored over scholarship forms, studying late into the night, and writing essays that conveyed not just her academic abilities, but her story, her struggle, her dreams, and her unwavering belief that education was her ticket to a better life. As the deadline for applications drew near, Adanna faced another hurdle. Her school didn't have the resources for a computer lab, so she had to walk miles to the nearest cyber cafe to submit her application. The journey was exhausting, and the cafe was often crowded with people, but she never let the inconvenience discourage her. She made sure her application was perfect, knowing it was her only shot. Weeks passed, and the anxiety of waiting consumed her. She continued her studies, but her mind often wandered to the university admission letter she desperately hoped to receive. Then, one day, it came. The envelope was small, but it held the promise of a future she had worked so hard to build. When she opened it, her heart leaped. She had been accepted. The joy was indescribable. She ran to her parents, unable to contain her excitement. Her mother cried tears of joy, and her father, though stoic, nodded proudly, recognizing the weight of the moment. But Adanna knew this was just the beginning. The struggle had only just begun. University was both a dream and a challenge. The classes were rigorous, the workload intense, and the people she encountered were from different backgrounds, some with vast resources and powerful connections. At times, she felt out of place, like she was trying to keep up in a race where others had a head start. But Adanna was no stranger to hard work. She poured herself into her studies, often staying up late to complete assignments and preparing for exams. Her classmates, many of whom had never known hunger or hardship, were impressed by her perseverance, though some still underestimated her because of her background. But Adanna's academic brilliance began to shine. She topped her classes, impressing her professors with her sharp mind, work ethic, and insights. Despite the lack of material wealth, she had something more valuable: the determination to succeed, a deep hunger for knowledge, and an unshakable faith that if she continued to work hard, doors would eventually open. By the time graduation day arrived, Adanna was among the top students in her class. She had not only earned her degree but had also gained the respect of her peers and professors alike. But she knew that the world beyond university was a different challenge altogether. Success wasn't just about being smart, it was about connections, power, and privilege. Adanna had learned this lesson the hard way, as every job application she submitted seemed to end in rejection. Still, Adanna refused to give up. She continued to pray and trust that her breakthrough would come. And though the doors were not opening yet, she remained steadfast, confident that God had a plan for her that was bigger than anything she had imagined. Then came an opportunity that could change her life. After years of struggling, Adanna finally started her own business in project management. When the government announced a big contract for a multi-million naira project, she knew it was her chance. She spent sleepless nights preparing her proposal, making sure everything was perfect. When she submitted it, she was confident. Weeks later, she was invited for an interview. She walked into the office, dressed in her best suit, her confidence high. The panel was impressed. One of the directors even told her, "You are the most qualified for this project." She left the office smiling, knowing that her hard work was about to pay off. But a few days later, she got the news. The contract had been given to someone else, someone who did not even qualify. A man who had powerful people backing him. Adanna felt her world crashing down. She had done everything right, yet she was pushed aside because she had no political godfather. She could have cried, she could have given up. But instead, she decided to do what she had always done. The news stung deeply. The contract had been awarded to a man who, on paper, was not even close to her level of expertise. The worst part. He had powerful backers, politicians, businessmen, people with money and influence. It was a reality she had known all along but had hoped wouldn't come to pass. The system wasn't fair, and it was hard not to feel as if all her years of diligence had been for nothing. She sat at her desk, staring at the email that confirmed her failure. She could almost hear the laughter of those who had dismissed her as just another ambitious woman trying to make it in a world designed for the powerful and connected. She imagined the director's words at the interview, "You are the most qualified for this project." How hollow they now seemed. The weight of the disappointment was almost too much to bear. It wasn't just the lost opportunity, it was the crushing realization that no matter how hard she worked, there were forces beyond her control that could override all her efforts. She had been rejected, not because she wasn't good enough, but because she didn't play the political game. In that moment, Adanna felt utterly alone. She could have cried, could have thrown in the towel and accepted that maybe this was just how the world worked. But that wasn't who she was. She had never been the type to give up when things got tough. She had faced too many obstacles to let one setback defeat her. Instead of succumbing to despair, a different thought entered her mind, one that had always been her anchor through the storms of life. Prayer. Adanna had always believed in the power of prayer. It was her refuge, her source of strength in times of hardship. Whenever life had pushed her to the edge, she had turned to God, knowing that there was always a way forward, even when the path seemed blocked. This time, she knew, would be no different. She stood up from her desk, walked over to the corner of the room where she kept a small, worn Bible, and opened it to her favorite passage, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." It was a verse that reminded her that she wasn't alone. Even when the world seemed stacked against her, God was with her, guiding her steps, providing for her needs, and lighting the way forward. Adanna closed her eyes and began to pray, not just for peace or understanding, but for the strength to keep going. "Lord, I trust in you. I trust in your plan for my life. I know that you are my source of strength, and I believe that you have a purpose for me beyond this disappointment." The prayer wasn't just an appeal for help, it was a declaration of faith. She was choosing not to let this setback define her, but to allow it to fuel her determination to rise above it. She asked God to guide her steps, to open doors that no man could shut, and to give her the courage to keep moving forward, no matter the obstacles in her way. As she finished her prayer, a sense of calm washed over her. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from knowing everything was going to be easy. No, this peace was deeper, a quiet assurance that even in the midst of adversity, she was never alone. The road ahead might be difficult, but she knew she had everything she needed to face it. Adanna opened her eyes, feeling renewed and more determined than ever. The fight wasn't over, it had only just begun. She wasn't going to let one setback define her future. She was going to keep pushing forward, using her skills, her faith, and her perseverance to carve out her place in the world. The contract that changed everything wasn't the one she had lost, it was the one she was about to claim, through faith, hard work, and a relentless spirit. Adanna sat still in her room, the heavy weight of the last few days pressing on her chest. The air was thick with tension, and she knew the battle was far from over. Yet, in her heart, a voice echoed, quiet but firm, "This battle is not yours, it is God's." She closed the door softly behind her, ensuring no distraction would disturb her. She took her Bible in hand, the sacred book that had always been a source of strength and comfort in her life. Kneeling beside her bed, she placed it before her, open to the Psalms. She could feel the battle raging around her, unseen, but potent. The enemy had taken many forms, some visible, others cloaked in the shadows of her life. Her mother's words returned to her mind like a soothing balm, "The darkest battles are won in the midnight hour." She was determined. This would not be just another prayer. This was war. The clock struck midnight. She lifted her hands toward the heavens, her voice trembling but resolute. "God, this battle is not mine. It is yours." Her words were a cry of surrender and yet a proclamation of trust. The first night passed in tears. She cried out to God, reminding him of his promises, promises of protection, provision, and victory. "You said no weapon formed against me shall prosper," she whispered between sobs. "You said that the righteous shall not be forsaken, nor their seed begging bread." Her tears were not just for herself but for the generations that came after her, the ones who would inherit this battle, her faith, and her God. Adanna's words grew stronger as the night wore on. Each promise she repeated from the Bible seemed to soak into her spirit, nourishing the very core of her being. She could feel the weight of her fear beginning to lift, but it was still a struggle. She prayed with passion, binding every power that had come against her, every force that sought to tear down the life she had built, every lie that sought to steal her peace. Her prayers were fierce and relentless. By the time the first rays of dawn began to peek through her window, she was exhausted but at peace. The first night of prayer was complete, and though she hadn't seen a miracle, she knew something was different. She could feel it. The second night arrived, and with it, a change in her spirit. This time, as she knelt to pray, there was no sadness, no tears. Instead, there was something deeper, an undeniable boldness. It felt as though her words carried power in the atmosphere. "I declare victory over every enemy that stands in my way," she declared, her voice unwavering. Her confidence was palpable. "I declare victory over fear, over doubt, over every attack of the enemy. I am more than a conqueror in Christ Jesus." As she prayed, her mind replayed every situation that had caused her pain and uncertainty in the past few months. There had been people who had spoken against her, situations that seemed hopeless, but now, it was different. She stood taller in her spirit, her words no longer pleading, but commanding. She was no longer the victim. She was the victor. "I rebuke every spirit of oppression," she cried. "I speak deliverance into every corner of my life, and I take back everything the enemy has stolen." Adanna paced back and forth, speaking life into the situation. She felt an electric charge fill the room, as though her words were stirring the air itself. She felt the shift in the spirit, stronger, more powerful. God was hearing her prayers. She could sense His presence wrapping around her like a shield. The third night came, and Adanna was no longer the same. She had spent hours in prayer, her voice now hoarse but her heart steadfast. As she lay down to sleep, she felt a deep peace settle within her, a peace she had not felt in weeks. That night, the dream came. She found herself in a vast, cold courtroom. The walls were lined with dark wood, and the air was thick with formality and tension. She stood at the edge of a large, polished table, her heart racing. A judge sat at the front, his face obscured by shadows, but his presence was powerful. A sense of anticipation hung in the air, as if something monumental was about to take place. Suddenly, a voice broke the silence. It was commanding, and yet strangely comforting. "The case is being reopened," it said, echoing through the chamber. "Justice will be served." Adanna's heart skipped a beat. The voice didn't come from the judge, it came from somewhere beyond him, from a source that felt as though it carried the weight of eternity. She stood frozen, watching as the judge's gavel came down with a resounding strike. Justice! She woke up with a start, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. Sweat clung to her skin, and the room felt strangely cold, as though the dream's presence lingered in the air. But there was something different now. A sense of certainty. Her heart raced not with fear, but with a deep, unshakable faith. Something was about to happen. She couldn't explain it, but she knew in her spirit that the battle was over. The victory had already been claimed. Whatever had been stolen from her, whatever had been unjust, was being restored. The enemy had been put on notice. Justice was coming. Adanna sat up in bed, her hands trembling, but her heart was full of faith. She could hear her mother's voice in her mind again, "The darkest battles are won in the midnight hour." And in that hour, she had won. Adanna's heart raced as she gripped her phone tightly, trying to steady her breath. The voice on the other end of the line had barely finished speaking before she jumped to her feet, her pulse quickening with a mixture of fear and hope. The director's words echoed in her mind, "Come to the office immediately." Her legs felt like lead as she hurried to get ready, the thought of what could be happening rushing through her mind. The interview had gone well, or so she thought, but what if this call meant something else? What if it was a mistake? She pushed the thoughts aside and focused on one thing, trusting God. As she arrived at the office, the cold, sleek glass doors felt like they were standing between her and a future she wasn't sure she was ready for. She walked past the security desk, nodding quickly as the receptionist gave her a polite smile, but she didn't register the friendly gesture. Her mind was too consumed with the unknown. When she entered the boardroom, the atmosphere immediately hit her. The tension in the room was palpable, and the faces around the large table were stoic, almost unreadable. The head of the panel, a man in his late 50s with glasses perched on his nose, motioned for her to sit. His expression was serious, but there was something else there, something that made her stomach tighten with a strange sense of anticipation. Adanna sat down slowly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as she waited. Her heart drummed in her chest, and she could hardly breathe as she noticed the papers and folders spread across the table in front of the panel members. They were scanning through them, avoiding her gaze for a few long moments. Finally, the head of the panel cleared his throat. "Adanna," he began, his voice steady but with an undertone of something else, something she couldn't place. "After further review, we have discovered some irregularities in the selection process. The contract was unfairly awarded." Adanna's breath caught in her throat. Her mind went blank, her heart faltering as the words sank in. She wanted to speak, to ask questions, but she couldn't find the strength to form them. She just sat there, frozen, watching the man as his gaze finally met hers. "We've decided to cancel the previous selection," he continued. "And based on merit, you are the rightful winner." Tears sprang to Adanna's eyes, blurring her vision. Her pulse raced, and her chest tightened as everything seemed to shift around her. She wanted to cry out, but all she could do was sit there, stunned. Her heart had barely registered the words, but her mind was still trying to comprehend them. She had won. Not by force. Not by manipulating or fighting against the process. Not by complaining or demanding what was hers. No. She had won through something much greater than herself. She had won by surrendering her battles to God, by trusting that He would fight for her. As the reality of the situation dawned on her, the tears that had been building for weeks finally broke free, streaming down her cheeks. She didn't care who saw them. She didn't care about anything in that moment except the overwhelming wave of gratitude and relief that washed over her. The director spoke again, his voice softer now. "We want to extend our sincerest apologies for the mistakes that were made during the initial selection. Your qualifications and performance are exemplary, and you've earned this opportunity. We believe you are the right person for the role." Adanna could hardly respond, her voice choked with emotion. She nodded, her heart racing with a mixture of joy and disbelief. The confirmation she had been praying for had come. Her faith, her prayers, her trust in God had led her to this moment. In that moment, she realized that the victory wasn't just in receiving the contract, it was in knowing that God had fought for her when she couldn't fight for herself. The countless nights spent on her knees, the moments of doubt and fear, had all led to this. God had never failed her. She stood up slowly, wiping away the tears that still flowed freely. The director extended his hand, and she shook it firmly, her heart filled with gratitude. As she left the boardroom, her steps were lighter than they had been in weeks. Her victory was not just about winning a job, it was about the deep, unwavering faith she had found in the battle, the assurance that no matter what, God would always show up when she called. As she walked out of the building, a fresh sense of purpose rose within her. She had won, yes, but more than that, she had learned that true victory lies not in what we achieve, but in what we surrender to God. And as she stepped into the bright daylight, her heart knew this was just the beginning of something far greater than she could imagine. The power of midnight prayer. Adanna's testimony spread. People marveled at how she got back what was stolen from her. But she knew the secret, she had fought in the spirit, and God had given her victory. Many times in life, we face battles that seem impossible. But the power of prayer, especially midnight prayer, can turn situations around. Adanna's story is a reminder that when men say no, God can still say yes. Whatever battle you are facing today, don't lose hope. Take it to God in prayer. And watch how He will fight for you. If this story has inspired you, take a moment to say a prayer for your breakthrough. Your testimony is coming.